All right, everyone. So welcome to our Community Planning and Zoning Community of Practice within eXtension. I'm Anna Haynes. I'm a professor and extension specialist at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. I teach natural resource planning. So this is our second webinar this year. We'll hope to do a couple more back in the fall. We'll take a hiatus over the summer. The title of this webinar is Community and Land Use Impacts from Climate Change. We have three speakers. Tom Blaine is going to start us off. He's from Ohio State University Extension, and he's going to get us all on the same page with respect to climate change science. Our second speaker is Jim Shortle from Penn State, and he's going to talk about climate change adaptation in terms of land use and infrastructure planning. And our final speaker is Jim LeGros from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he's going to talk about climate change adaptation in terms of the built environment. With that, I'd also like to remind everyone that we would love to hear your evaluation of this webinar. And there should be a link within the original page that this is in. Like Mark just said, there will be a recording of this webinar, and I'll be posting that in a few days. With that, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to Tom Blaine to start us off.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. Want to thank everyone for attending. I'm going to bring up my slideshow right now, and let's see here. Okay, my slideshow is entitled Overview, Climate Change Update 2018. I am Thomas W. Blaine. I go by Tom if you'd like. I'm a professor, associate professor at Ohio State University Extension, where I've been for 23 years. I want to give you a background on global climate change, global warming, and what's happening, what the current state of the environment is. When we talk about global climate change, we are talking about the effects of global warming that are being brought about by humans. Human beings, we are burning a lot of hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, and that's putting a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is enhancing the greenhouse effect. Most of you have heard about the greenhouse effect. You're aware of this. Ever since the end of the last ice age, concentrations of CO2 were about 280 parts per million in the atmosphere. It was constant within an extremely narrow range. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've gone up to about 405 to 410 parts per million. You know, percentage-wise, you can see that's a pretty dramatic increase. And we're headed to 450 by 2050, and we're heading to 560 by 2100. That's the trend we're on. Notice that 2100, that 560 would put us at double the atmospheric concentration from before the Industrial Revolution, from 280 to 560. And like I say, we're currently at 405. It's pretty easy to forecast out what's going to happen by 2050 because most of those things are in place. Most of the technology is in place. The further out you forecast, the more unknowns there are. I want to talk about the effects of on global temperatures so far, the actual effects of the increase in CO2 that we've seen. We have two data sets: annual surface level temperatures, which go back from 1880, and then monthly lower troposphere temperatures, which are taken from satellites that go back from January of 1979, almost 40 years. I want to show you these trends in temperatures. There's the surface level data. You can see it was, pretty flat, really, from about 1880 to up in the 1930s. We started the trend up, then it kind of leveled off, and then since 1980, it's just zoomed up. global average temperature. And so we've increased from the baseline, from the average, about a degree Celsius, which is about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit if you look at the lows that occurred around World War One, when we have the low for the data set. You say, well, you know, a degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot. It is a lot, because the difference between the temperatures we have now and the ice age, in which there were glaciers all over northern Ohio, was only 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That's it. Global temperature. You think, wow, how could that be? Because we're talking about the whole globe, and global warming is never homogeneous. It's occurs at certain latitudes more than at others, and we'll get to that. But you know, when we talk about 1.8 degree difference, we're almost 20% from an ice age to now. So it's a very significant amount of warming in a fairly short period of time. Here's the satellite data I told you about. I want you to look at that satellite data. It started in January 79. Look at the red, if you will. The red is 13-month moving averages. You know, we had a very warm spike there in the middle of the data set back in 97 and 98. That was caused by a very strong El Nino. Pushed temperatures way up. It alarmed a lot of people because they thought, wow, if we continue on that trend. But we weren't going to continue on that trend because that was caused by an El Nino. So, in fact, when you look at the ups and downs, you notice that there's a trend in general, but the ups and downs are caused primarily by El Nino, La Nina phenomena. But the thing about it is, if you put a trend through there, you'll notice that to the left, most of the red is below the axis. To the right, most of the red is above the axis. And that is warming. And that warming trend right now is about 1/4 of a degree Fahrenheit per decade. So in the 20th century, global average temperatures increased between about 1.4 and 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 0.15 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. In recent years, however, as I mentioned, the warming trend has increased to a higher amount per decade. Not only is the temperature increasing, but the rate of increase is increasing. Okay, on the trajectory we're on, global concentrations of CO2, which I told you about 405 to 410 now, parts per million, as opposed to baseline 280 prior to the Industrial Revolution. They'll be at about 450 by 2050. And we can expect from that an increase in global temperatures close to 2 degrees Fahrenheit, between 1.5 and 2 degrees Fahrenheit above the level, the current level, let's say, over the last 2 to 3 years. Now, I want to make sure that you understand that this trend in global warming is being caused by humans. There's no question whatsoever about that. This trend is being caused by humans. We saw the ups and downs. Those ups and downs, they're not mysterious. They're caused almost entirely by El Nino, La Nina. Also, volcanic activity has an effect. You know, when you have Mount Pinatubo back in the early 90s, if you go back to the graph when you get an opportunity, and you will have an opportunity, this will be recorded, you'll see that when we have Mount Pinatubo, it lowered the Earth's average temperature almost 1 degree Fahrenheit for over a year, with all of the solid materials that it put in that blocked the sun, blocked the UV rays from the sun. El Nino, La Nina, they have a big impact. Also solar impact. The solar output is not constant, but solar output in recent decades is trending down, not up. It's trending down, which should be causing Earth to cool, but it's not cooling. And so there is no other factor. It is human activities which is driving the trend toward warming, specifically the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. So we know that very well. Global warming is not evenly distributed. As I indicated before, I told you we'd get to this. Warming is taking place much faster in the Arctic. It's taking place faster in the northern portions of the temperate zone. Canada, for example, is experiencing more warming than the United States. Even within the United States, the lower 48, the warming is taking place faster in states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, than in states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. The northern tier, it's taking place a little bit faster. Now, when you think about warming over space as well as over time, we're talking about moving climate zones north. Okay, so if you think about that, this means that by 2050, where you are now, let's say you're somewhere in the continental United States now, and you want to know what the what the climate will be like, let's say in early June, since that's when we are, get in the car and drive 100 miles south of you. Take a look at the climate, or get on the Weather Channel and look at the average temperatures there this time of year. Compare them to where you are. It's about 100 miles, because that's the rate at which we're moving. About 100 miles over the next 30 years at this latitude. Now you have to take into account that if there's a mountain range south of you, it's not going to get warmer. It's actually going to get cooler. There are other factors: urban heat islands, proximity to water, elevation, microclimates. So when you have a zone map, a climate zone map, you know that they're not in straight lines. They're in squiggly lines like that because of those other factors that determine the climate. However, in general, those will shift up. They'll shift north, roughly about 100 miles between now and 2050. This causes things to bloom earlier. For example, things bloom earlier in Tennessee than they do in Kentucky or Ohio, and leaves change colors, earlier in the fall up north. And these are called phenological networks that people study, and that in itself is a very interesting field of study, phenology. What happens after 2050? Well, it's more difficult to say, because we don't know how serious people are going to be about curbing greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2050. It looks like now, if you go out to 2050, a lot of the effects of global warming are going to be benign. Most of the predictions are that agriculture will be more productive in 2050 under a warmer environment than than agriculture is now. Corn yields, wheat yields, and things like that under a slightly warmer climate in the United States will go up. However, when you continue that outlook past 2050, it goes from a benign impact to dire somewhere toward 2100 as warming continues past that. So at a minimum, we should be exploring ways now to replace hydrocarbons as a source of energy with other forms of energy. Now, I got my references here. The Climate Science Special Report, Fourth National Climate Assessment. I encourage you to read that. Those have come out about every 4 years. They're now up to 4. Those are excellent. They make for very good reading, pretty easy to understand. You can look at my global climate change fact sheet I published in 2015. Right there's it's on Ohio Line. You can Google Thomas W. Blaine Global Climate Change fact sheet. It'll come up if you don't have the website. I'm pretty easy to find on there with my global climate change stuff. For gardening, I think that Patty Glick is one of the best. Gardener's Guide to Global Warming. Google Patty Glick, Global Warming and Gardening. The Phenological Network page is on there. I talked about phenology just a moment ago. And there's a blog that I have, and you can get onto that blog and see previous blogs. Global warming is about more than carbon dioxide alone was the last blog entry that I had in there back in 2016. But I have several blog entries over about a 2-year period. And here's my contact information. Feel free to call me, 330-466-7877. You can email me. You can visit my YouTube channel. I've got some presentations on there. And thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Very good. So that gets us, a base, and we're now going to turn to Jim Shortle. So as he is putting up his screen and PowerPoint, I just want to remind everyone that in the chat, I guess, or in the Q&A, please ask your questions, and we will get to them at about 12:50 or so. So, Jim, it is all yours.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks, Tom, for a nice introduction, and thanks the participants for being on. So my background is as an economist, environmental economist at Penn State. I've been here for a very long time. I've been working on climate change since the 1990s, and I have done work for the US EPA, DOE, and the state of Pennsylvania on climate change. I've done for the last 8 years periodic assessments of the impacts of climate change. And Penn State is a renowned place for climate science because we have some of the most prominent climate modelers in the world. So it's you can't be at Penn State and not know about climate change. So Tom talked about changing climate, and I'm going to talk about implications of changing climate and how to think about it. And I'm really in the context of this planning. So we call it adaptation, and it is really important. But just to begin with, when you think about climate, climate matters a lot to land use and planning. Don't even have to think about climate change, because you know that the climate within which you live influences the suitability and demand for land where you are. If you're in the desert, you're not going to have a lot of agricultural production unless you've got some irrigation. If you're in the humid east, like I am, our climate completely shapes our environment, production, all sorts of things. We've got lots of water, population pressures, physical vulnerabilities. Tornadoes and hurricanes happen in certain places. So if you look at things, climate, it is really important to planning, building codes, and to pretty much everything in the way we do things. So what happens with climate change is it does matter too. And what it does is, I say here, it upends historic facts that we use. So if you've been in Pennsylvania, for example, developing building codes for a long time, you're thinking about certain kinds of windstorms, certain kinds of snowstorms, certain kinds of temperature regimes, and basically all of the historical facts for this get upended to varying degree depending on where you are. So if you're in Colorado, for example, which is expected to warm substantially, a lot of Colorado had to have very warm or cold tolerant types of pavements in roads. Now they have to look at pavements that take a lot more heat because of their changing climate. That's just an example of how climate change does change the historic facts that matter to your planning. At the bottom, I'd say that, and I'll talk about this more, that climate change greatly increases the information and analytical challenges for smart planning. So within the planning community, we've been talking about smart planning for a long time. But when we have climate change, it really does mean new challenges for smart planning because of information requirements. And I'll talk about that as I go along. So just some words to talk about. One is that we talk a lot about climate vulnerability. I don't actually love this word because it implies that there's not good things from climate change. And in fact, there can be good things for climate change. Tom referred to the fact that agricultural productivity could be increasing for a while. That would be a beneficial outcome. If you look at cold weather related diseases, they would go down. But generally, we're worrying about climate vulnerability, the sort of bad things that can happen to us from climate change. So when you think about that, and the dimensions of vulnerability, there's a paradigm that I'm going to describe here in how you think about that. So one key issue when you're thinking about vulnerability of your system that you're managing to climate change is the exposure of it to climate change. So clearly some places will experience more and different kinds of climate change than others. So in northern, and Tom mentioned this, in northern and southern latitudes, you are having much more rapid climate change than you are having in middle latitudes. If you're living on a coast, then you're going to be facing storm surges that you would not face if you were inland. So sort of your exposure of organisms, ecosystems, built environment, etc., to climate change will vary according to the climate change you have. And then partly, some things are really exposed to climate and some things really aren't. Greenhouses are something we use to diminish exposure of systems to climate, as are buildings and a lot of other things. Another issue we think about is the sensitivity of organisms, ecosystems, built environments to climate change. Does it have a big impact or does it have a small impact? And for example, if you are depending on rainfall for your agricultural production, and you don't have irrigation, you have a system that's going to be very sensitive to climate. And then the final is adaptation, and adaptation is what we can do to respond to climate change. And there's, this is where I'm going to go next. But I think in the planning context, planning is really about adaptation to climate change. So historically, we plan with certain assumptions about climate. With climate change, we have to have new assumptions, and our planning activities have to be as adaptation activities, take that new information into account, and those will be determining the impacts of climate change. I want to talk a little bit about this exposure issue a bit more. You can break exposure down into direct exposure and indirect exposure. So direct exposure generally refers to the changes in the weather that you're going to experience where you are. So precipitation patterns, intensity, frequency, severity, temperature, and those things. But climate change induces a lot of other kinds of changes that you would have to contend with as a planner. So changes in agricultural production, for example, will occur globally because of climate change, but they'll affect prices of agricultural commodities around the world. Those prices will actually induce changes in places where we are, just related to the price changes rather than the climate changes themselves. And you can give lots of examples how indirect effects matter a lot. The agricultural one is really important because sometimes we have this work that we've done in Pennsylvania where climate change would have a certain effect on our productivity, but price changes would actually counter those effects. And it's really interesting. So you can't tell the story of the impacts of climate change on agriculture in Pennsylvania or other places just looking at productivity. You got to think, just looking at the productivity, you have to look at the price changes as well. So just turning a little more to the types of impacts that we would have in communities. In terms of direct impacts, you're going to have loss of life, injuries, property damage, economic disruptions from floods and violent storms, morbidity and mortality from heat waves if you're in a place that's going to be sensitive to that. Here in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, southeastern cities in Pennsylvania are very sensitive to heat. Heat waves will be a problem. Water quality degradation will be an issue that we think will be large because we'll have increased water temperatures, which will be harmful to fish, other aquatic resources, and increased frequency and severity of runoff events because we expect to have bigger, more intense storms. Indirect kinds of changes you might have, changes in economic activity. Pennsylvania, something we expect is reduced snow cover during the winter. In fact, we've been experiencing that a lot. That has a big impact on tourism. If we lost our trout fishery, we could have bigger impacts on tourism. So you have those sorts of indirect effects. One that we worry about a lot, especially in other parts of the world, is in and out migration. If you look within the US, people may choose to move out of places that become more storm prone or flood prone or become really uncomfortably hot. to places that are milder and nicer. So migration is something that climate change will induce. Communities will have to cope with that, either because they lose people or because they gain people. Excuse me. Allergy season here. Energy costs, insurance costs, and coverage are all things we would expect to be affected by climate change because of changes in risk. Outdoor recreation already mentioned above. Turning to what we do about this, and again, moving towards the planning thing, a paradigm for thinking about adaptation is I'm presenting here, and this is a fairly common one. Reactive adaptation is adaptation that you do in response to climate changes you have experienced. Or it could be climate events you've experienced. The New Orleans hurricanes are a very good example. Planned adaptation is deliberate things you do in anticipation of climate change. So you expect climate change to be occurring, and you take hopefully rational activities to deal with that. Autonomous climate change, basically in the literature, is things that other people or organisms do about climate change to adapt to climate change that you as a planner would have to respond to. So you will have changes in natural systems that are a response to climate change. They're not managed by humans. They may be influenced, but they're an autonomous response. Farmers will change their production activities in response to climate change. People will change all sorts of things in response to climate change. Those changes are things we call autonomous. And as a planner, and thinking about how you adapt to climate change, you're going to have to think about how they are, and those autonomous ones are what we call them. So just sort of these are some views that I call from the literature, and sort of what I think climate change means for the role of planners. One is to facilitate autonomous adaptation. So here I'm thinking, that neighborhoods, communities, businesses, farmers are going to be responding. You want them to respond well. So that means that you want to provide them with information about climate change, climate futures. That's good. Provide them with adaptation options, which makes sense. And importantly, provide rules and policies to guide private autonomous adaptation. So a lot of the things that happen with autonomous adaptation may need to be constrained so that they are socially beneficial. So here I'm thinking about building codes, flood maps, insurance requirements, pollution policies, zoning, wetlands protections, a whole set of things that are not infrastructure investments, but actions in which communities, planners need to be working to guide the autonomous adaptation we have, and we will have being a lot of it, and it may be the most important kind of adaptation we actually have, what people do in response to climate change themselves. And the other, and one that we talk about a lot, is adaptation of public infrastructure and public services. So the roads, the buildings that planners are guiding. So those are the dimensions. Now, the one thing that, and I think about this more and more, is what is actionable information about climate change? So Tom had predictions of climatic averages into 2100. From now to 2050, things on average are very stable. After 2050, we don't know what's going to happen because we don't know about mitigation policies. But even around that path from now to 2050, there is actually, in terms of realized climate change, a lot of uncertainty because the climate models model averages, and there can be great variability around the averages. So we really don't know what our future climate is going to be. So when I think about climate change, and I'm putting myself in the position of a planner in New Orleans or in State College, I begin to think about what decisions are we making and what do we have actionable information about. So a question is, what is the specific climate vulnerability that you have? Increased frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events. Pennsylvania, when we look at our climate projections, we can predict increases in averages. We expect increases in variability. But how much we have in terms of increased variability, how many really heavy bad events we have, we don't know. But that's really what we're worried about, is the extremes. What are the dimensions of the climate risk? How often, how severe, and where? So these are very concrete pieces of information that you would want to have to make concrete decisions. And then what are the dimensions of the possible impacts? What is at risk? Population, job, facilities, critical infrastructure. So I think when you even move this down a little bit to what are the options, you're thinking about new and better flood maps, building restrictions, building codes. If you're going to have a lot more runoff, as we expect in Pennsylvania, we're going to think about, well, how high should we build bridges? What should we do with existing bridges? If you're in New Orleans, a huge question is how high the levees should be. Well, we asked the same question in other places. California just required green roofs. No, excuse me, Denver required green roofs on all new structures as a method of helping to handle runoff. So there's a set of options, and looking at the cost effectiveness, ecological and social implications of these options are things we must do to decide which ones we like. So this leads us to what I think the biggest questions are, and that is prediction and assessment. So I've said climate change upends historic facts. Stationary is dead is a common thing we say in hydrology literature. Deep uncertainty means we don't know a heck of a lot about important things about future climate in specific places at specific times. Climate averages, we can say what the averages would be, as Tom described, but the extremes around those averages we don't know very well. And really importantly, that kind of information is the kind that people normally think about when they're thinking about adapting to climate change, the changes in the weather that they experience. But these indirect effects are really very, very important. And in fact, the indirect effects, and there's various studies that show the indirect effects can change the sign of the direct effect and can actually be stronger. So you can't quit your planning with thinking about what is the weather going to do just here. It's going to be what climate change in your region and around the globe may mean for you in addition to your own impacts. So in terms of decision strategies, I'm making your life complex. I apologize for that. I can't avoid it. One thing we talk about is no regrets planning, and it's where you do stuff you should be doing anyway. And I think we can identify, and I think looking at James Grove's presentation, he's going to be identifying things that I think of as no regrets planning. They're probably things you should be doing anyway. So this is good when you can do it. So things that make sense in your community, smart growth strategies and others, you need to do them. But you can't assume that all of the good adaptations are like that. So the levees in New Orleans, for example, it costs a lot of money to build those levees higher. So how high should you build them is a non-trivial question. You have a risk of a big flood that's hugely damaging, but you also have high costs. Another thing we say is adaptive planning. So when we're making decisions, we can make them now and make very long-lasting infrastructure decisions, and we may have to in cases. But in other cases, we may be able to wait a while, wait until we have new information, and then be flexible and change. And this is good advice when you can do it, but delays can be costly. And where I live in Pennsylvania, we're having to make a lot of big infrastructure decisions to cope with the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. We have no choice because of federal policy. And there's words down there that people use and all make sense. Robust, resilient, and there are more. But there are strategies out there that can help, but there's none that really solves all your problems. So when I kind of conclude about how I think about this, I believe it's essential that when we're making long-lasting planning and infrastructure decisions, it's essential that we consider the kinds of climate change we're going to have in our region. I think it's also essential that we recognize not just the direct effects, but the indirect effects because the indirect effects may be actually more important for your community than would be the direct effects. So if you live in a nice place where people will move to because of climate change elsewhere, it could be that that migration has a bigger impact than climate change within your area. I think it's important to recognize that planning mistakes can go two ways. One is the mistake you make because you don't plan for climate change. The other one is the mistake that you make because you expect the worst to happen, or you underestimate the risks knowing they're going to occur. There's no solution for that, because that's just the life we have when we have uncertainty. I think it's also important to recognize risks from multiple stressors. We have climate change, but we also have a lot of other things going in our societies that create stresses on our communities and community planning. So in this region where I am, we worry about climate change, but we also worry about invasive species and a variety of other things. And these risks are interacting. So that's my take, and it is, I think, a little more conceptual. But I think in terms of addressing climate change, it is important to conceptualize it and to recognize the risk and uncertainties involved in it. And I will say sources, there's lots of sources on what I presented, and it is fairly common knowledge. But the number one source for a lot of this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that is there. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jim. So if you could stop sharing your screen, and then Jim LeGros, you are up to share your screen. And I just want to remind all the participants, if you have any question, you need clarification on something, a definition, if you want more references, whatever it happens to be, if you have examples that you would like to share, anything, please ask. So Jim, you are up, and you have about 15 minutes, and we'll still have time for questions. So carry it away.
Okay, and you can see my screen, I assume?
Yes.
Okay.
And I can hear you.
Great. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Anna. I'm an urban planner and a landscape architect and professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I've worked in private practice, and I do a lot of community engaged work with my students that focus on built environment issues, urban design, policy change to make our communities more sustainable, livable, healthier. So this is more or less some of the things that I often do with communities, and I have a case study that I'll talk a little bit about at the end, where we did some sustainability planning for the region around Madison. And this is what I intend to cover real quickly, briefly. Obviously, these are complex issues, and there's a lot of information that could be presented on all of these. But I'll begin with talking about challenges, and specifically focusing on policy legacies. It's an interesting concept when you think about policy legacies, because many of the decisions that have been made in some cases over a century ago still affect our built environment today. And not always for the good in terms of climate adaptation or for public health. And so part of what I'm going to be talking about is how we think about our built environments, and retrofitting is very much a big part of climate adaptation, in my opinion, as well as trying to create communities that are healthier and more sustainable and livable. So I'll just present real quickly a few paradigms that you may want to think about. In this country, over 100 years ago, we designed and built combined sewer systems where communities were relatively small, populations were not real large, and this map of Washington, D.C. on the left is an example of this, where even to this day, parts of DC are using combined sewers. So sanitary waste and stormwater run in the same network of pipes. which when weather is benign is not a big deal, but as soon as we get a big storm like a hurricane come through, this is what you see happen. The sewage treatment plant can't handle all that water and waste, and so it basically spills out into the Potomac River, and unsuspecting residents of places like Alexandria are actually standing in very contaminated water, which clearly is not a very healthy thing to do, but a lot of people don't understand that. So as we think about making our cities more sustainable and certainly more climate adaptive and resilient, we have to look at our infrastructure systems and really think about how we can invest very smartly in retrofitting our cities, and this is one place to look. Another paradigm that really affects our built environment is shown in this little cartoon or caricature of a city. Pre-World War II, we built communities very much in the sort of the traditional sense, and if you know anything about new urbanism, it's all about trying to get back to the pre-World War II models or paradigms of how we build neighborhoods and communities. Post-World War II, for a lot of reasons, population growth being one of them, but also federal highway programs that funded highways and other infrastructure, really created a very different landscape. And the pejorative term is sprawl, but it's essentially very separated land uses, very low densities, wide streets, and not very walkable, not very efficient for public transit, and very land consumptive. And so we have both of these built environment types in the United States as well as in some other countries. And there are implications to both of these models in terms of sustainability, resilience, public health, and climate adaptation. So if you look at vehicle miles traveled, which is one of the metrics that urban planners and transportation planners often look at, you can see, and this is a map of Chicago and the Chicago region, if you live further away from the downtown, you tend to drive a lot more than people who live closer to downtown Chicago. And obviously, if you're spending a lot of time in a private vehicle or a truck, you're contributing a lot more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and contributing to some of the problems that Tom talked about earlier in this webinar. And these patterns can be replicated at any major metropolitan area that you look at in the United States. Similar phenomena are happening. When we design and build cities that are very low density and spread out and not very walkable or very well served by transit, we end up creating places where you can only get from essentially point A to point B by a car. So they're not very walkable, and there's a lot of interest in the public health field in terms of the health implications of suburban areas in particular, where children can't really walk to a local park or certainly can't walk to school, and they spend a lot of time in vehicles and not getting enough physical activity. In addition, when we do a lot of driving in metro areas, it contributes to air pollution, which has a lot of health implications also in terms of asthma and other health-related diseases. And then finally, something that's near and dear to my heart, since I spent a lot of time in private practice as a land planner, how we manage stormwater is really indicative of the paradigms that we believe, and perhaps we're educated, if we're a landscape architect or an engineer that does a lot of site planning, you can see these remnants in the landscape. Fortunately, most landscape architects, and I can't verify that civil engineers are following suit, but certainly landscape architects are not trained to do any of these things on this photo. Mass grading, creating paved stormwater runoff paths like you see here, or big seas of asphalt. These are all things that contribute to flooding, contribute to urban heat island effects, and are not very sustainable, let alone adaptive to climate change. So basically, and Jim mentioned this, and I'm going to expand on this point, is that if we really want to be serious about making our communities more sustainable or climate adaptive, we really have to look at governance, because public policies continue to influence how we design our built environments. They shape through building codes, through zoning codes, through subdivision ordinances, through transportation plans, and other infrastructure capital investments. They really do affect many of the things that we really care about as citizens and as individuals. And if you have a family, if you have children, obviously you want your children to grow up in a healthy way. Our public policies really do affect the quality of our communities. And so I really believe that we need to do a better job of communicating, coordinating, collaborating across these silos that have been very effectively set up in local governments. And we also have silos, obviously, in state government and the federal government. But there hasn't been traditionally, over the last 50 or 60 years, I would argue, as much coordination and communication across these silos as we really need. So one of the things that I believe, if we want to do a better job of retrofitting our cities or adapting them for climate change, as well as these other important objectives that I talked about, public health, sustainability, livability, we need to get these different disciplines working more effectively together. And that's what leads me to the second part of this, which are opportunities for paradigm change. As Jim mentioned, there are a lot of good ideas out there, and these are some of them: smart growth, sustainable sites, which is something that landscape architects talk a lot about, new urbanism, green buildings, green infrastructure, complete streets. These are all essentially best practices for physical planning and urban design, and they're not just unique to the United States. They're now globally accepted, but not globally implemented. And that's the real challenge I think communities face, local governments face, and universities face in terms of educating the next generation of planners, landscape architects, engineers, public health officials. It's really, I think, it comes down to changing paradigms. And this little graph at the lower left hand screen just sort of reminds me to mention the fact that population globally continues to go up, and population, particularly in developed countries, is aging. And so that has all kinds of implications for transportation needs, land use needs, transit, things like that. So the good news is we already know, I believe, what to do to make our cities climate resilient, climate adaptive, as well as sustainable, prosperous, and more livable. The question is, how do we do that? How do we implement that? And this is a model that I've developed in thinking about built environments as a complex system of systems, essentially. So there are infrastructure domains that are inherently complex systems and really require multidisciplinary solutions. So transportation planning for many decades has really been in the bailiwick of transportation engineers, and I think in many cases to the detriment of communities, because we've gotten very good about moving vehicles effectively. But as I pointed out earlier, some of these places that we've been building are not very walkable. There's a lot of impervious surface, which contributes to flooding and all sorts of other unintended consequences that need to be addressed, I think. And this quote is it's from a book that is, if you're interested in this issue, I highly recommend it, but it sort of is emblematic of many of the things that I teach my students, is that good design makes a city function better, not just look better. So it's certainly aesthetics are important, but there are all sorts of other reasons to design great cities, and that relates to many of the things that we've been talking about: climate adaptation, resiliency, sustainability. So I'll just go through a few of the ways that urban planners and landscape architects think about making our cities more climate adaptive. And one is in terms of reducing effective imperviousness. So in a natural environment, forested or grassland environment, most of the rainfall that falls on individual sites or landscapes, essentially much of it infiltrates, some of it, there's a lot of evapotranspiration, and there's relatively little runoff in terms of the total precipitation. But as we develop cities, obviously you can see that there are a lot more impervious surfaces, and that means a lot less evapotranspiration, a lot less infiltration, and a lot more runoff, which can have negative implications, obviously, offsite and downstream. Jim mentioned Denver. There are other cities, Chicago, New York, and if you've traveled to Germany or Switzerland, you'll see many, many green roofs in those places. And this is all about philosophy or paradigm. You know, if you value things like livability and climate adaptation, you will, as a community, try to promote through incentives or regulations, or in some cases even subsidies, more green roofs, because cities have a lot of roof surface, which is an obvious statement, but when roofs are just pure impervious surface, all that rainwater has to go somewhere. With green roofs, much of it can stay on the roof. And these places, the picture on the left is in Chicago. These places can become parks. They can be urban parks, places that people enjoy. There are other ways to reduce effective pervious surfaces or impervious surfaces, and that's in places where climate is relatively mild. This happens to be in Portland, where they don't get a lot of snow and ice. Using interlock pavers, which are pervious, allow stormwater to infiltrate in the parking lanes, so that you're using traditional asphalt, although there are asphalt mixes that can actually allow infiltration as well. But in this case, you're allowing a lot more infiltration to occur. You can also create rain gardens just off the street, as this picture in the top. And this is in Madison, Wisconsin, where the rainwater from the street is encouraged to go into these rain gardens, and they more or less stay on site, and you can create some pretty cool gardens if you select plants accordingly to those habitats, those environments.
Jim, I just want to, sorry, it's 12:53, so I know you have quite a few more slides, so.
I can buzz through them perhaps, or unless you want us to just stop.
No, you can keep going, but go a little bit faster here.
Okay. So let's see. I'm going. Okay. Transportation options obviously reduce greenhouse gas emissions if we encourage alternative forms, increasing energy efficiency, retrofitting buildings. And then theory to practice, this is something that I've talked about previously. This is a study that came out from the Woodrow Wilson Center not too long ago, again, making this point that local governments really need to change how they are structured and how they operate. So reflecting on some of the comments I made earlier, Everett Rogers wrote a book called Diffusion of Innovations, which I think is a great book, and it talks about taking best practices, in this case, my case, taking best practices for sustainability and diffusing them, spreading those best practices to other communities and other practitioners. And then this comes from an IPCC report from 2007, thinking about risk assessments and then mainstreaming adaptation. Those are huge challenges, but that I think are critical steps toward making our cities more climate adaptive. Risk assessments, Jim mentioned this a little bit, and again, another favorite quote: floods are acts of God, but flood losses are largely acts of man. We've made a lot of dumb decisions, frankly, in terms of how we've built our environments. In many cases, we've put them in harm's way. And what we need to do is think about retrofitting, and in some cases even retreating away from the riskiest areas. So really demolishing buildings and turning it over to green infrastructure. Mainstreaming adaptation. The American Society of Civil Engineers does an annual report on the nation's civil infrastructure, and I'll just emphasize the point that there are a lot of other professions that have a lot to contribute to rethinking our civil infrastructure in this country. And then the case study, I think I'll just stop there and skip that part. Is that okay, Anna?
I think so. Although, you want to just go through the slide just so we can see them a little bit?
Okay.
Why not? I don't have active questions either in chat or the Q&A. So, yeah.
So we have a little time.
We have 4 minutes.
Okay. Well, this was just a 3-year study. We got funding from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We went through a collective active impact process here in Madison, and we tried to do many of the things that I've argued for in this webinar. We tried to bridge silos, really look at multi-purpose infrastructure as a way to accomplish all sorts of additional objectives in addition to climate adaptation. We used a theory of change process. There's a very good reference from the Aspen Institute if you're interested in this process. And then we are essentially targeting retrofitting. So selectively identifying places that can be adapted for a whole range of purposes, not only making them more climate adaptive, but well served by transit and bicycle and pedestrian paths, but really focusing density in these areas that you can create essentially urban villages within the metro area. That's it.
Great, thank you. We do have 2 questions. Where'd it go? Or 3 even. Well, I lost one. So one is about cost. So, right, lots of places are always, these things are too expensive. And that seems to supersede all the other arguments. This comes from Carrie Papelbon. So how do we convince the decision makers to require some of these strategies or projects without being convinced that they're just too expensive, right? How do we get over that big hump?
Who's the question directed to?
I think any of you can answer. Whoever feels, I can ask a few more if you want to let that sink in. Another one was, how do you convince people in rural areas and local government folks in particular to think about climate change adaptation strategies? So, do either of you have, or either the 3 of you?
Well, I would say on the convincing local governments, I think there's a large literature on the economic benefits of doing many of these practices. There are all sorts of case studies that have shown that, for example, in Chicago, the Millennium Park was a very expensive public infrastructure project, but it's more than paid for itself in a very short period of time through increases in property value, real estate investment, through tourism, sales tax revenue, and a whole variety of other things. Obviously, Chicago is a very unique situation, but there are smaller scale examples of that where infrastructure, for a road or even replacing stormwater pipes, making accommodating larger volumes. Not all stormwater has to be run through pipes. You can use green infrastructure, which is more of a surface treatment, but it's managing stormwater, so it's mitigating and reducing the possibilities of flooding, but also creating habitat for wildlife, creating green space for people to walk. So it's really looking at these investments as multifunctional or multi-purpose. I think that's an important take-home message is, infrastructure investments should not be looked at as single-purpose investments in many cases, that it really try to identify the recreational benefits, the hazard mitigation benefits, the transportation benefits from individual single investments.
This is Jim. I would agree with all that what was just said. But I do believe that there is value in moving from generic discussions of adaptation to really explicit discussions of particular risks. And so I think many of the things that Jim is talking about are things that are accepted as valuable things without climate change and of demonstrable value. I think we do need to get people to thinking about climate change within those and factoring climate change into that. But I also think there are areas of planning where expensive decisions are being made or will need to be made that communities may not realize are climate sensitive. So, and this is sort of a new way of thinking to me, because my prior thinking had been largely of the no regrets variety. Let's just be doing the right things in the right places now, and it will help us with climate change. But I think you do see in some cases, very specific, very difficult questions that will have to be made in response to climate change specifically. An example that we have in Pennsylvania is addressing water pollution. So we are, because of the Chesapeake Bay total maximum daily load, having to address runoff issues in ways that many other communities don't have to do. Climate change becomes a very, very explicit consideration in that. So these communities today could be making plans for how to address the CSO problem. If they forget climate change in that process, it will be a serious failure. So I believe we need to be having people think explicitly about issues, climate sensitivities, and then what the implications and how we work through them with climate change. And one of the issues I come back to, and this is a difficult one, is we don't often have actionable information about future climate, because climate models give us averages rather than really the distribution of things that we will have. So I think that leads me to another place, and that is that fundamentally community engagement is essential to progress, because you won't be making, in the cases where they're not the win-win, no regrets type, you're going to have to be making difficult decisions that could be quite expensive, and that you would want to really have a lot of community buy-in and understanding when you do them.
I think that environmental economists have an obligation, a dual obligation here. I think one obligation of environmental economists is to show the public the costs of inaction. I believe it was Jim LeGros who showed raw sewage in the streets in Alexandria, where you had inappropriate infrastructure. Is that correct, Jim? That was Jim LeGros.
Yeah.
Where they had mixed stormwater, with sanitary sewer, and with increased high rain events that are going to be a result of global warming, you're going to get more of this. So the question is, yeah, it's expensive to separate sanitary sewer from stormwater, but we're starting to see states do that. Municipalities and states are passing laws where you can't mix sanitary sewer anymore with storm sewer. They have to be treated separately to prevent the kind of catastrophic scene Jim LaGrove showed. Imagine walking around. So we have to show that the benefits of these things are pretty enormous, and justify the costs of these kinds of strategies that both Jim Shortle and Jim LaGrove showed. The second thing is that as we acquaint the public, we as environmental economists have developed a lot of very good means for assessing public opinion on their willingness to pay through things like a technique called contingent valuation method, for example. It's a method of ascertaining from the public their willingness to pay for infrastructure that will reduce the likelihood of negative outcomes or disastrous outcomes. So environmental economists have a big role to play in this. And I think so far, in general, we failed as a discipline. The environment, and I'm an environmental economist, and I think we failed, and I think we need to get busy. And the younger generation of environmental economists needs to get busy in both educating the public and in obtaining from the public estimates of willingness to pay for these things that they can turn around and hand over to policymakers to demonstrate to policymakers the public wants this kind of stuff and is willing to pay for it.
All right, well, thank you all. I think this has been a really good discussion and webinar, and I sense we could probably talk for another hour. We are definitely over our time. Mark, I assume we need to wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm going to put just for our attendees, I just put a link for a survey in chat. If you don't mind, click on that and just give us some feedback there. And the only other thing is that, again, this will be recorded, and I'll put a link for the Learn event. I assume most of you probably got here via the Learn event, but I'll put a link in chat for that also, and a recording will be available there within a week or so.
Yes. So thank you, Tom, Jim, and Jim. I really appreciate you taking your time and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us all. And thank you, participants, for sticking with the webinar. And hopefully in the fall, we will have another set of webinars, and we will notify you of those as we organize them. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.